Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Nate.
Welcome to my channel.
Thank you. Thank you.
For those who I haven't met yet, my name is Nancy and I am a PM coach. I met Ryan maybe about a month ago or maybe 2 months ago from as a result of another stream that I was hosting. So I love doing these live streams. It introduces me to a lot of really awesome people, a lot of awesome PMs, and super excited to talk about Ryan's international perspective on product management, which is something that I think will become more and more important as more and more companies become more and more global. So, Ryan, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so I've been working in product for probably almost 10 years now. I've worked in Kenya. I'm Canadian, so I've worked in Canada. I've worked with people in the UK, obviously around Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so I've really worked with teams from kind of all around the world throughout my career in different industries. And it's something that I really like about technology is that we get this opportunity to interact with people and share about weekend plans where you're just googling where is this town that my colleague went to in some faraway country. So it's something that I'm really passionate about.
Did you live in those countries or you just worked with the teams in
I
those?
lived in yeah, I lived in Kenya in Nairobi for 4 years, and so that got
Wow.
uh, gave me the opportunity to work in Egypt and Turkey and fly into Manila
Oh my gosh.
multiple times. So it was very interesting learning about the different business and cultural practices, both in Africa, in the East Africa region, and kind of the Middle East and the ASEAN region.
Oh my gosh. And this is a great segue into my first question, which was how did you get involved? How did you get started in the first place with all these different product teams in different countries?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first experience was a few years after finishing business school, like my undergrad. I quit my job and I went and traveled for a year. But instead of doing a gap year, before Squarespace, there was WordPress, and I made a WordPress site for like 1 year entrepreneur, and I just basically did internships around the world, and it like exposed me to what I liked in technology in different countries, in India, in Tanzania, in Kenya, and South Africa, and so those were all very short things, and it kind of got me into this like way of thinking of like understanding users in different countries, understanding language and all kinds of things. So that's how I first got involved, was this way of like changing the gap year into like a career discovery year, and kind of just exploring what I liked and didn't like about jobs in different countries. So that's really what got me into it. And then ever since then, I've just tried to work on international products that can be sold around the world.
And what did you learn in your gap slash career discovery year?
Yeah, I mean, I learned that in my particular space of social ventures at the time, I learned that Kenya was an amazing place because it has both great internet connectivity, educated population, and it also has this extreme poverty in certain areas, or at least it's rapidly developing, but it did. You could go to areas without electricity relatively easily, a couple hours from the capital, and so it was bringing in like both amazing people from East Africa and around Africa and around the world to solve technology problems. And so I learned that like there's all kinds of interesting problems around the world to solve from a product lens. And that kind of like really showed me that like you could work also with people from around the world. Like I was remote working like a decade before the pandemic in one sense, because companies that are based around the world often have a headquarters in one country,
Mm-hmm.
money's flowing from another country, you're learning about like how to transfer money when you're like, I was in my early 20s figuring out what's a Swift code and all that kind of stuff like that. And so yeah, that's kind of what I was learning a lot about, like little things, and really like I also learned that I got yeses a lot in other countries, from users, which is like not uncommon even in
Yes
North
to what?
America. And yeses to like questions about a product. Like, oh, do you like? I was asking the wrong questions because I was an early PM. That's one thing. I was saying, oh, do you like this? Or you like always yes. So I was asking the wrong
Uh-huh.
questions, but also it was very difficult as an outsider in a culture to like get the right answers when doing user research about a product. So that's another thing. It's like really hard to go in and assume you actually understand your users in another country.
And where did you end up after your career discovery year?
Yeah, I went back to Kenya. That's how I spent 4 years there. And
Oh,
yeah, so I went back after spending like a couple months there. I went back and spent 4 years there. And yeah, I just really liked the country. And so I went back, spent 4 years, and like learned a lot about international business while living in Nairobi.
and what was Kenya like? So compared to all the different countries that you've explored.
Kenya is like it's the strongest country in East Africa. It has like I live in a small town now in Canada, like and the capital Nairobi has millions and millions of people, more than maybe around Toronto, which is the largest Canadian. But a lot of them are like in informal living and whatnot. So like there's no census that fully captures like
Hmm.
everyone. So it just has like an incredible like energy that kind of doesn't exist in like a quote unquote Western city
Hmm.
when like things are kind of regimented and under regulatory bounds. So yeah, and it's kind of like a melting pot of cultures from like long history. So it's yeah, it's a very interesting country to live in.
And what were you working on in Kenya? What was the product?
Yeah, I did a bit in solar microgrids. So basically, a microgrid is like a small grid. They do operate in the context of like established grids too, in terms of airports, sometimes have them, hospitals sometimes have them. Um, with renewable energy exploding, basically we could do solar micro hydro grids off grid. So if a village had established around, let's say, a fishing island, sometimes there was no actual grid there. Everyone was essentially using a generator or kerosene lanterns or whatnot. So you could go in and put a grid and then like wire it up and have no main line coming off that island to the mainland. And so it like and you could get cellular connectivity on these islands, but people were using generators to power their cell phones. So suddenly you have like LTE with a plug, and it's like all the technology was basically leapfrogging from cell phones leapfrogging to like renewable energy leapfrogging. So we were kind of piggybacking on top of that, and using the M-Pesa network to allow for payments. It was like an incredible experience of just watching. Yeah, Kenya in many ways, technology wise, is like ahead of Canada. Like e
Hmm.
transfers are like they're not as sophisticated here. You can't go up to a vendor and use a QR code to pay or use a 5-digit code. So in many ways, I was seeing what will probably happen here in a while when the regulatory frameworks allow for some of these kind of transfers.
Super interesting. And what was the biggest challenge you had during this discovery year in terms of um, um, working in different countries when you're young, just graduate? That this was when you graduated, right?
Yeah, I mean, I did work like for a couple of years after university, and then
Okay.
saved up some money, and then that allowed me to kind of make that work.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest challenge was like landing things that allowed me to like grow personally, because I was basically like networking live while kind of like going through traveling. So I would land in Kenya, try to find a role in Tanzania, try to find a role in South Africa, and like all these kind of things. And these were all like they were largely like volunteer based
I
things
see. I
because
see.
you can't really just go work in a whole bunch of countries and get paid really good
Right.
salaries. That,
Right.
that that's really complicated from like a visa and logistics perspective. But it was like taught me about branding and like selling myself really early and like doing a website, doing a blog, all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah,
like it allowed me to like learn while traveling, which is like I think a critical thing. If like if I take some too much time off, I'm gonna just start learning something. That's just the way I am.
that's amazing. And this takes me to my next question, which is what are some of the notable cultural differences you have observed in the different countries? And it would be very helpful if you could be as specific as possible.
Yeah. Um, so I mean, I think that in the medical device and the microgrid sector, like when you're coming into a country to do work, you have to be cognizant of its historical past. And I
Mm,
say this as like a white male from Canada. Um, Kenya has a colonial history with British, rule until many decades past. But there's still certain tendencies there where like people assume that you know what you're doing.
mm,
And I think that like in many cases as a product you're trying to discover and you're trying to explore, and you're trying to figure out what's working, what's not. And I found that like somewhat difficult to do with this kind of like racial dynamic at play, because I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing half the time. And like there's lots of like people that like I'm trying to learn from, but like there is like all these things that you have to understand. And you have to develop relationships with like trusted local partners and local
mm,
people to like really pull out things that are like relatively or easier when you're in kind of your home country. But it does allow you to see things that like other people don't see, like connected things, like, oh, I learned this back in like where I come from. And like you talk to a local partner and you're like, how can we blend these things together? And that's where some very interesting innovation comes out, where people like from different
mhm,
cultures blend ideas together. And that's, yeah, so yeah, in terms of how teams operate, I think that there is more of like a hierarchical culture still in a lot more emerging markets, like the whole flat culture, that like has kind of developed in certain technology companies where people are like autonomous, empowered, and they're like really like, um, that I found in some countries was like,
top down, you
not,
mean?
yeah, it was a lot more like top down. There was an
Okay.
assumption that people like would tell other people what to do, even in like startups or smaller companies. and
Uh-huh.
or, and so that was a bit different. I kind of like had worked in a company right out of university in Canada where it was like there was lots of free reign, and you just had to kind of spot the gaps in the business and like work on them and pitch solutions to the boss to implement. And
Mm,
I saw like a little bit less of that, and
mm,
assumption, like it was always kind of this assumption. And I don't know if that was 100% like a cultural gap,
mm.
or if it was just like the position that I had in the company. But like I did experience that a little bit.
What was the position you had at that time?
Yeah, I was like it was like account manager slash product manager.
Okay.
So like we were working with, this was while I was at Steamaco in the microgrid space, and we were often working with small utilities, like upstart utilities that wanted to operate kind of off the grid.
Mm,
And so um, it wasn't like, but we had people that were like line technicians that would build the grids, and almost like a construction piece. And like, yeah, it was sometimes it was like difficult to make sure that like where I sit with them, because like in product it's there's the whole like lead with a like with kind of like your team, but you don't have authority.
right.
So like it was the same thing in those scenarios where it was like you're trying to get buy-in, but then there's like a cultural authority piece, and you're like, no, 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 this is not actually like a real thing. Like
What
we're
is
all
the
a team.
cultural authority piece? What does that mean?
Yeah. So I believe that because of like colonial history, there is an assumption in some countries that like have a colonial past, that like the person coming in from overseas with overseas education like is like they know what they're doing. And
Oh.
like they're the ones that like need to tell us what to do. And like, whereas I think to get things work in a like local context in Kenya, like I didn't know a whole lot about like how to get things going in Kenya. So I needed to find people um, that like I could talk as peers with. And that like, yeah, there's a lot of people like that in Kenya that are like way smarter than me.
So you're saying you were given a lot more authority than you had anticipated?
I mean, yeah, I was given a lot more authority, but like there was also like um, people would just assume that I know what I'm doing. And I was in my 20s. I
Oh.
didn't know what I was doing. Like I feel like in Canada, like young startups, you all just kind of bumble together towards the
Mm,
finish line, and you all
mm,
kind of like understand that like I don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing, but like maybe you try to pull in a mentor or an advisor or something
right,
like that.
right.
And like everyone kind of is like, oh well, like let's push and pull together.
Let's figure it out together. Yeah.
Let's figure it out together. And
Hmm.
like, yeah, it was a bit more like, you know, traditional companies that aren't in innovation in emerging markets. There's usually like, you know, a president with a big office and then
Got
like
it.
layers. And so I felt like that was like a big shift when
Hmm.
you go, but there are like a lot of startups. There's also a challenging thing like about raising money in emerging markets where like raising money is easier if you have networks in where the money's from.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people that like bring people that they trust in, but that may not be the best people to like run a business in a different country. So there's all kinds of like complexities around that too.
Got it. So when you were in Kenya, were you also working with teams in other countries, or you were just working with the teams in Kenya?
Yeah, I mean, we were trying to sell into other countries. Like at the time
Okay.
that I was there, a stat was like there were more people without electricity than when the light bulb was invented, or something like 800 million didn't have electricity in home. So there was a large portion of individuals that were in like we were trying to get into Nigeria, Ghana, and so those were clients. But like the
Got it.
team itself was mostly UK and Kenya. And so like the UK had a few like founders and other things were going on there, and then like suppliers, and then Kenya was a large portion of the
Got
staff
it.
of this small company.
So how do you communicate with the UK team versus the Kenya team? Are there differences in terms of communication style?
Yeah, and I mean I felt like the anglophone kind of colonial link and like the westernness of like expats and like the Canada British link. It was like much easier to just like get rolling with peers from Kenya and peers from the UK actually.
Uh-huh.
Whereas like and some of the people that hadn't interacted with foreigners as much from Kenya took a bit of time to build rapport. And I guess I understand that. Like we kind of take it for granted here in Canada that like when you start with a company that's like a corporation, there's probably like 50% immigrants that are already working there. So you just kind of like you're used to it. Like
Mm-hmm.
you know, from even my first 3 years out of university, I was working with companies that had 50% immigrants. That's just the way it is here.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like a little bit slower getting used to like
Mm.
how to communicate in a way that it's like, hey, I'm a peer, let's work together on stuff. There were other people that had worked with immigrants, and then it kind of like speeds up the process of relationship building, I felt like.
Were you put in a position to be the connecting person between the Kenya team and the UK team?
um, I was mostly with like the Kenya team, yeah.
Okay.
So mostly there, but I think the other thing that is challenging in these international business settings is like R&D tax credits. So it like at least in the UK and Canada, if you do your R&D in that country, and probably in maybe you can speak to the US, but if you do your R&D in a country, there's usually tax credits associated with that and write-offs and whatnot. So it does make this whole international business thing kind of complicated when you're like,
Mm.
okay, the best candidates in Brazil, but there's no tax credits maybe, or how do I do the tax credits when I have like a whole team? And
Right.
it gets really complicated in those kind of
Mm.
like scenarios. So like there is all kinds of little nuances to international business where like and that like that company that I did work with ended up moving to the UK with most of their like staff because the tax situation was just like really advantageous to do R&D there,
Mm.
grants, investors, and all kinds of things. So even though their principal markets was not the UK, they kind of chose, and that was the best for them from like an investor and financial
Oh.
perspective. Yeah.
How does that impact the employees on a day to day?
Yeah, I mean, technology is like incredible. Like you can, be on WhatsApp. Like before Slack was like as dominant as it is now, there was so many like personal channels that were like very easily to kind of fill those gaps. They weren't
Hmm.
as good as kind of like the Slack channels and Teams and stuff like that, but it was like very easy to just be on a WhatsApp call, like anywhere with LTE,
Hmm.
and kind of communicate synchronously, and then like the Google Documents with live back and forth was like so easy. It's been so easy for like 10 years that I feel like that's and all of the companies I've worked with, except for maybe one, have focused on at least like breaking bread once a year, like eating together. And so that's been something that I've always enjoyed, like with teams that people may be living in different countries, but you get together in the same place and you actually meet live and you eat.
Across the global teams.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
wow. Wow. And where did you go after Kenya?
I came back to Canada, so I'm
Oh,
a
okay.
Canadian. So I came back to Canada, and I worked for like a large telecommunications company. And so when you work for a large enterprise in Canada, they offshore a lot of work, and so that was really like kind of like my experience, like with a large like professional kind of international scope, because like
Uh,
usually in small companies like people are just kind of, they go where life takes them, and sometimes the company's just like whatever, we'll set up a payroll entity there. And so
mm.
it's like people are in different countries and in time zones, but you're like really small and the communication is like really tight, whereas when you get into enterprise level like offshoring, then it's kind of a whole different beast.
Tell us more about that. What is your experience working with offshore teams and where are these teams?
Yeah, so I mean, I got the chance to work with people that were based in Manila, in the Philippines,
Okay.
along with like in Brazil and Ecuador, developer teams in those countries, and like the teams in Manila would work our time zone, which is also something that I've always felt like. So for those of you that don't know the Manila West Coast time zone, it's like not good. You're like starting work at like 11 p.m., ending at like 7 a.m. or something like that.
Wow.
It's like because it's a big time zone gap to the West Coast.
And
So
is that an expectation for them? Or
that
they
was at that
okay.
company, which I was like, do we really need this massive time zone overlap?
Mm.
Like, could we have done it like 4 hours overlap or
Right.
something like that, or something like?
Could you?
Um, I mean, me as a worker, yes. What it's like gets into company policy
Right.
and stuff like that. That's just the way that it was set up.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is kind of like
And
interesting how like it has opened up, technology has opened up work for the world, but
right.
like it's still like it's weird when you're on a call and like right now, like we've talked about like lighting in these kind of situations is
Yeah.
like it's like important, and like when someone is like on a call and you can tell it's like 2 in the morning because they're like back, they're like blinds are like black dark and the room is dark because like they have other family, and it's
Oh.
like there's all these like little cultural elements that you're like, oh, I just feel bad you're up at like 3 in the morning like working, you know.
How how do they feel about that? Because if that was the way of life and that was the expectation, how did how did it affect their productivity or their
Yeah, I mean,
burnout?
I think that like it was an opportunity for them, but it was also like it showed how like incredible like lucky we were to be like remote
Mhm.
on our local time zone,
Mhm.
and to be like in our house, and like also it's not like healthy. Like I found that like people that were up all night, like they also got sick more
Yeah,
because it was like it's just not healthy for you to,
right,
because it's like they often have families and other commitments that like get them up during the day, and
right.
like obviously that's not something that like they want to happen, but it's just the fact of life that
Yeah.
like sometimes they have to like get up, and so they're like kind of like trying to juggle two worlds, which is something that like yeah is really really hard.
Were you able to, accommodate their time zone to the best of your ability despite the policy that was in place?
Yeah, I mean, I always tried to operate in like an async way with
Mhm.
like Atlassian and kind of Confluence files being like, okay, this is what I need. I tried to like make sure that it was like we needed to do no in person time. Like there's always a
Right.
few days notice in advance. Here's what's required.
Yeah.
So like I felt like we could do it like a lot of, and there's times when it's like a launch window and you're like, okay, we need everyone like live, and in those cases like that's very difficult to do. But
Mhm.
yeah, I if there were launch windows like on like a Saturday at like a midnight Pacific time, I'd be like, great, it's your like local time, it's better
Right.
for you, so can we shift your week around to make it like
Mhm.
more advantageous? But in a large company, it's also very difficult because like if you move someone's time, then how like do they have to tell a manager? Does that person have to tell a director?
Right, right,
You
right.
know, it trickles, and that's the difference between like the smaller company stuff that like
Mhm.
I was talking about earlier, where it's much easier to just be like, okay, I'll take a call at 11 p.m. I'm going to sleep in tomorrow
Right.
because like it works for you in Australia or something like that.
Yeah,
And it's just like a lot more like flexible all around. Whereas in big companies, it's like, it's just a bit more challenging.
that's hard. And was this the engineering team in Manila?
We had like a content team. So like
Okay.
in website work, there's like a lot of um, stuff that just needs to be done to finish the end product. Like once the
Mhm.
copy's been written to get it into like all the alt tags, everything like that. So they
Yeah.
did a lot of that stuff, like
Mm.
all the kind of, and the QA team was like offshore and some other pieces like that. So um, yeah, that was kind of interesting. And ironically, for my a job a couple of years before, I like saw the tower that they worked out of when I was like in Manila, because like has a big logo on their tower. So I'd like seen some of the like offices and the office parks, and it was really interesting because like when you stay near them in like a hotel,
Yeah.
they kind of operate like 24/7. Like the businesses don't close because like
Oh.
staff are kind of coming in on this full like rotating, because some people are servicing like the North American time zone, then
Oh,
the European
wow.
time zone is like a bit different. And so these kind of office parks in places like Manila are very different from like what we think of as an office park in Canada or the US, where people kind of come at 8, leave at 5 or something
Right.
like that, and kind of it dies down in between. It was like a very like fluid kind of, and the food courts and restaurants around it were kind of just like humming all the time.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But you said Kenya doesn't operate that way.
Kenya has a really good time zone for like the UK and Europe.
Okay, I see.
And like yeah, it's so it operates a lot closer to kind of
Mm,
the time zone of kind of Europe,
got it.
but and it has like an okay time zone for like New York, so those were kind of
Okay.
easier calls there, and then like West Coast, it's very very challenging. It's like a 12-hour time difference or something like that
That
sometimes.
is.
Yeah, so it doesn't have the same kind of outsourcing hub that kind of
Mm,
it's getting. There's some companies that are interesting, like and Andela is like a kind of a tech platform that is focused on outsourcing, and they're getting into that in kind of Nigeria and Kenya. But
oh, wow.
yeah, Manila is renowned for its kind of like call outsourcing and chat outsourcing and
I
everything like that.
see.
So they have a whole kind of like economy structure,
Got it.
which will be very interesting as like kind of AI explodes. Like, what will that do to kind of these outsourcing based
Right,
markets where a lot of it is like humans kind of like
right.
powering? service sector that we use in our technology.
What about your team in Brazil? What was it like working with that team versus Manila?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Like, so I've seen two different types of like QA and like content management is like kind of like one skill, and then that was in Manila, and then Brazil was like product owners,
Mm,
designers, and developers. So they're like very different skills. So my experience has been kind of skill based. But like, yeah, I've loved working with like Brazilians that I've worked with have been very colorful people and like
mm,
very energetic and like
mm.
very social, and it's been like incredible to like work with them.
Yeah.
And it's really like, and it's easy too. It's like maybe 4 hour time difference max with like
Mm.
the West Coast. So you at least get like 2, 3, 4 hours
All
depending
right.
on like how you structure your day. And really think that's where the future of like outsourcing is.
Mm.
It's like these like 4 to 5 hour pods. Like I
Right.
think Europe and Africa will do quite
Yeah.
well together, and
Yeah.
like here in Latin America will be increasingly like dependent,
Makes
and
sense.
like yeah, like compared to like working with teams over like in India or Manila, it's just, like so much easier. And like, yes, should we all be like perfect, like async people and have our documents well written? And in reality, like having a couple hours overlap in an 8 hour day is like makes a world of a
Yes.
difference.
Yes. Completely agree. What about language barriers um, with regards to collaboration? What was your experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I've being English speaking is like an incredible door opener around the world. And so I've found it like very easy to go to anywhere where like a British person put a boot in the ground. Like at some point, there's like usually like English will typically work, and then as a
Mm.
Canadian, I can like flip into French like fairly easily.
Lucky.
Uh, so that opened up like a lot of like work. Like in Africa, I could easily flip back and forth,
Right.
and I can't speak Spanish, so that kind of does limit the kind of Latin American piece. But it like English, like my I think one of the things that I've learned is that like people also like want to learn English. So if you like
Mm.
slow down, make sure they
Okay.
understand everything like that, and like you do have to have that conversation like with people. I think like how do you want me to like if you slow down and they've been
Mm.
working hard at something, then they're like, can it be insulting to them that you're like, hey, do you not think I know how to
Oh.
speak? And like, I feel like
Oh.
there is some like dynamics there that you have to be like cognizant of how like hard the other person's working to communicate with you
Oh,
in a second
wow.
language. And like, yeah, it's the ability to like do what people are doing in like Latin America in a second language is like incredible. I'm
Right.
like, wow, like if you guys were in your native language, like you'd be like way ahead, of me at least. So yeah, I think language is like important. And I feel like after developing relationships with people, like there's one product owner that I still keep in contact with, and like she used to be like, "Hey, is this the right word? Is that the right word?" And like
Mm.
after we developed a strong relationship, and then I'd be
Mm.
like, "Oh no, I would use this, but that one's totally fine." And like, and
Okay.
then that would help her because then she's reporting to her boss, and like like communication is like. But I find that like I've also heard of things where like if you take five non-English native speakers and you put them in a room, like they'll speak freely, but then you throw like an English native speaker in and they start like second guessing and like
I see.
interpretation, and like also I don't use the right words all the time because like I didn't study the structure super well. Like I'm not like an English major, so
Right, right.
sometimes I use the wrong things and they're like interpreting it one way, and I'm like, oh wait, I didn't mean that. Like I just like speak without thinking, which is like, so you have to like remember some of these things that
I
like
see.
international teams are often, they learn how to speak like the right way, and when you don't think before you speak, you can actually say the wrong thing.
Is there a difference in terms of um, let's say the teams in Latin America learning English versus in Asia learning English. What was that like? Are there nuances there?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the Philippines is like unique American influence in history means that like the English language skills there are like very strong.
Mm,
Also, I think like the decades of like business process outsourcing there
mm,
have developed like a strong learn English. It's a pathway to like success.
okay.
So like English was like I mean, you'd go around Manila, everything would be in English, right? And like Tagalog as
Oh,
well. But like there's like so it's kind of like Canada with English and French. Like everyone, like well, a
oh,
lot of
okay.
Canadians can flip back and
I
forth if they're
see.
in the eastern part of the country.
So
Yeah.
is English so in the Philippines, is English something that is more than a subject in school, but it's more embedded in their daily way of life?
Um, like I felt that in both like in colonial countries, this is a huge generalization probably, but in colonial countries in general, people would do business in one language and then like relax
Oh,
in another language.
I
And
see what you mean.
so like yeah, in Kenya there was like a lot of like English spoken in professional settings. Like even like you go to like a fireside chat with like two tech leaders. That's done in
I
English in
see.
some of the best co-working spaces in Nairobi, and there are like lots of pockets where Swahili and other languages are
Mm,
spoken in professional settings, but it's often among like peers. And then it's like as soon as it gets to like legal situations and stuff like that, English is often the default. And it was like that in the Philippines as well.
got it.
So you could easily like get by.
And
And that's why I didn't really learn very much Swahili
I
because
see.
just got really
How do
relaxed into this setting.
how do
Yeah.
they learn the language? How do they learn English other than learning in school? Is it something they have to also work hard on their free time, or just by going through school they could be
Yeah. I think in
proficient?
a lot of countries, English is like now a strong school subject.
Okay.
So I think that, like, I mean, it's unfortunate that like some other languages are dying off because of this dominant
Mm,
global language, and
mhm,
but like it does make it easier for people to like converse internationally.
mhm.
And yeah, it is taught through a
Got
lot
it.
of schools, and like degrees are often done in English in a lot of these other countries, which
Right.
I didn't know until I'd like traveled and worked, and
Super
like yeah, you
interesting.
see degrees on their walls in English
Oh,
in other countries, and you're like, oh, maybe like, and official languages are English, but like the language that you'd hear like maybe in a mall would be like
yeah.
totally blended, like English,
Okay.
Tagalog, in Kenya, it's Swahili,
I see.
Kisi, other languages. So yeah.
Here in the US, a lot of people take Spanish as second language, but I don't think a lot of Americans are proficient in a second language. So I'm just trying to figure out what the difference is, probably because we don't need to communicate on a daily basis in the second language that is taught in school. I don't know.
I think it's like opportunity.
Mm,
If you were in the US and you could like double your salary if you learned Mandarin, there'd be a lot of people
I
like out
see.
there being like, I'm learning Mandarin,
I see what you
and
mean.
like, yeah, and the official language of the US is English, and its history comes from the UK, and
Right.
so like I think countries that have that kind of UK driven history speak
Mm,
English as a primary business language. But yeah, even like there's a lot of schools in countries where English is not the dominant language that they're like learning English, and
mm,
so yeah, it is making it easier to kind of do business internationally.
got it. So interesting. And we're so lucky, I feel.
Yeah. I mean, we are so lucky, but I think that like you need to like learn still that like how to communicate,
Mm.
even though it's like your language. There's a language, and then there's like communication, and I
Yeah.
think that like the communication piece has taken me a long time to understand, like, okay, what am I not picking up from this conversation? Like, what cultural pieces, what language pieces, what other piece, gender pieces that like I'm just not picking up, because like I think that like there's all kinds of things that like power outages. Like I've I've had like one scheduled power outage this year that my utility like let me know they were doing scheduled maintenance. And like in a lot of countries, power outages are like super common, and like traffic is like crazy. So like there's like speaking the language, and then there's like
Yeah.
understanding the other person's like life, that is like quite critical when working internet like with an international team, because it's like, oh, I'm running late for a meeting because I'm stuck in traffic. Like in my small town, you never get stuck in traffic. So it's like, but like
Got it.
if you think, hey, this other person's like living a totally different life from me, I gotta like give them a break. They're like,
Right.
there's all kinds of things like that that like you have to just like learn to work and gel as a unit in a different way, than if you're just all clustered around the same boardroom table.
How do you learn about the cultural piece?
I'm personally like very proactive on this stuff, and like I
Mm,
feel like in remote, this stuff won't happen in a scheduled meeting. You have to be proactive about it. You have to
I
like
see.
find time to meet with your team members, like one on one on a
Got it.
weekly, bi-weekly
Got it.
basis.
Got it.
Talk about festivals. Google's amazing. You can be like, oh, what's this festival in this town in Brazil that
I
like they're
see.
going to? Like, what does it mean? Like,
Yeah.
what's great about it? Like,
Right.
what is private school like there, and all that kind
Mm,
of stuff. Like all those like little things, like
right.
caring about people, like doesn't change if you're
Yeah.
like in your own town or international. Like it's still a critical piece. I mean, it
Right.
does kind of feel weird though when you like disconnect, because you like you're not never going to see these people walking down the street at a grocery store again. Like
Right.
you're kind of like leaving a team, and you're like, oh wow, those people that I know around the world, like I'm not going to engage. But like thankfully with WhatsApp, you just put in someone's number or name, and you're like on LinkedIn, you're chatting to them. Like
Yeah.
I still chat to lots of people from around the
Yeah.
world that I've known. Yeah.
So this takes us to the fourth topic that I want to ask you. Um, other than learning the culture and taking a more proactive approach, what other lessons or insights have you learned um, based on your experience that you want other people to also know?
um yeah, I mean, I think that like get a time zone thing on your computer, like on your desktop and other things. Like that's like a little thing that like goes a long way.
What do
Is
you
like,
mean by a time zone thing? Like a world clock thing?
yeah, like I have like a little widget and kind of on
Okay.
my Mac in the upper thing, and I can
Yeah.
just quickly like gaze at what time it is.
Mm,
Like it's little things like knowing when the other person accepted a meeting and showed up, that you like, oh, I wasn't expecting you here. It's like 6 a.m. there, and like
mm,
it's like you're showing kind of empathy, that you're like, whoa, like
yeah.
you're doing a lot to be here,
Yeah.
and that kind of stuff. And also like try not to book those meet. Get really good
Right.
with like time zone and booking things like that. Like those little things go a long way. And also like explaining the product, the situation, like in like, because like when I worked for like a telecommunications company, the services are like available locally. This person, like, there's a product termed dog fooding. International teams can't dog food. You can't like go out and buy this product and test it out and all that kind of stuff, because like it's literally not available there sometimes.
Mm,
So you have to be very explicit and like explaining how it's used, why it's used, how you fit into other competitors. It's like
yeah.
you have to like make sure you bring people like along for the journey. And then the beauty of that is you get to learn about their country too, and be like,
Hmm.
oh, what do you use, what do you like about it, okay, and then you tie it back to your user stories and your other experiences. And so I think that has to be something that like you work on. And like it's always interesting when you like go back and forth and you're like, oh, there's this thing in your country that we need to incorporate into our product in my
Mm.
country, because like we're not doing that. And that's like the beauty of this whole thing.
Right.
So
Um, what are some of the important moments that you remember when you ran into cultural differences that showed up in like a work product or in like an email you wrote, then you realize, oh wait, there's a difference in the culture. Maybe I need to change my language, or maybe I need to change my requirements, user stories, or whatever.
yeah, I mean, often I like just went in assuming a situation, and whereas I feel like when people like, and this goes back to like me being like a white male. Maybe I'm just like I in Canada, like I grew up as the default, and I think that like yeah, race does play a big factor in how you view the world, and like that was really stupid in hindsight. That like
Wait,
I would
what
go
do you
into
mean by that? Growing
like
up as a default.
you go into the situation assuming you know what's going on,
I see.
and like yeah, in Canada and the U.S., most decisions historically were made by white men, and
Mhm.
so I just assume I know what's going on because this is the lens that I have. But
Yeah.
like, whereas like the best people I've worked with are often not from that situation. They come with a different lens. They're like immigrants. And like, you know, when I go to Kenya, assuming that I know what's going on was totally dumb in hindsight. But like when people come to Canada and they're not from Canada, they
Yeah.
never assume they know what's going on. They always
Mm,
ask better questions. And so like, I think for anyone going to work with international teams,
yeah.
assume you don't know what's going on and just like have those relationships, ask the right questions, and like especially if you're like me, if you're because we're not the majority in the world. So like, you know, like assume that you don't know what's going on.
Mm,
Assume like there's all kinds of like things that you don't see.
right.
And that's where these like beautiful international teams come in because like and like there's kind of a 2 by 2 kind of rule. I don't know if you heard this, where like it's like two people talk, then the next person talks. Like this is something I've learned kind of recently. Like it's very easy for me to like get going in a meeting as a product manager or something and not get everyone's feedback because in different cultures, like men speak differently, women speak differently, like in terms of like how often and when and who has confidence in a scrum
Well,
setting.
what does that mean? The men speak more often than the women on a scrum team?
If they're comfortable, yeah, certain
Mm,
people
okay.
from different backgrounds may speak more than others, and I think that like if you are the one coordinating that team, it's
Mm,
your job to get the best insights out of your whole team,
right.
and like that means making space for people that don't feel comfortable stepping forward.
Yeah.
That's something I have been working on, and like it's because I'm comfortable doesn't mean everyone else is comfortable. And this is especially important, like in an
Mm,
international setting where there's like cultural and all kinds of like layers and like age layers. So I might be older than someone, so they may think I know what I'm doing. So you have to really like, and that's what I think is challenging with working internationally is like
right.
there's more layers there, and
Mm,
you have to understand people more, and it's not just like you're flipping on your laptop setting up a Zoom meeting with someone from around the world and it's going to like work like that. It's like
right.
you got to develop the same relationship that you do
Right.
with someone down the road,
Right.
and more, and really understand. And because I've made so many mistakes, I'm getting better at doing this,
Oh
like
my
with my
gosh.
new teams.
That's amazing. And what is your ideal work environment like based on all these learnings that you've had?
I love working with people that want to like contribute to the product, and solution that we're building, but
Mhm.
like also like have balance in their lives, and like have an ability to say, okay, like we should just step aside and chat a little bit, and like I think that's like critical. It's like sometimes you have to like um, there's a military expression, and it's like slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and it's like it's related to like mechanics and stuff like that. Of like when you're doing drills repeatedly, if you make them smooth, by the end like 10th time they'll get
Mm,
fast. And I
mm,
think that like it's the same thing with like relationships. You go slow,
mm,
you get
mm.
smooth, you get into a rhythm,
I
and then
love
you can go
that.
fast. And so I think that it's especially critical with international teams that you kind of develop that early reps
Love
to
that.
develop. Yeah.
Love that. Well, I love this conversation a ton. I don't have a lot of international working experience. Uh, I am super intrigued now.
Yeah, I mean, I've loved it. I think that this is where like the world is going, is more of us working internationally.
Yeah,
And now it's so easy with products like Deal and others to like set up payroll in other countries.
right,
I think that what we see after COVID of like the US going super remote to like any state, it'll be interesting to see if in 10 years that like already you're seeing global first startups that are going everywhere from day one. And I think
right,
that'll be more and more common. I think that like as people want to expand, like it's critical, like having someone in the country being like, oh, what would it be like in your country if we launched there? Like
right,
that having that person on like a scrum team you already have is like invaluable.
right. Well, would you prefer to have Scrum team co-located?
I think that within a 4 hour time zone is like totally
Okay.
fine.
Okay. Yeah.
And then if you can get them together once a year
Right.
and actually meet and engage, like I think that is like great.
Yeah.
I would rather like great people than a great
Hmm.
location,
Right. Right.
because I think that like if you can make it work for their lives, then people can bring themselves to work in a better way than if you kind of force them into like one
Yeah.
lane.
I love that. I love this
Yeah.
so much. All right. So, folks who want to connect with Ryan, scan the QR code here. And then, is there anything else that you want people to know?
No, I mean, I think that if you haven't done remote, there's all kinds of amazing ways that you can kind of like dip your toe in it. And international with like ADP list,
Yeah.
other sites out there, even LinkedIn, you know, you can connect with people
Mm,
and set up a Zoom and see, is this, do I want to do it with an international team? Do I want to like, you know, do that kind of international oriented career, or do I just like, you know, working co-located like you mentioned? So if people are interested, like you can easily kind of test the waters online
yeah.
with some of the solutions out there right now.
I love it. Well, thank you so, so much for this conversation. The replay will be available on LinkedIn and on YouTube. And where did you set up your channels to, Ryan? On your LinkedIn
Oh,
and where else?
yeah, YouTube,
Okay,
Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Yeah.
great. Oh, Twitter too. Amazing. All right. Well, I hope you have a great day ahead. And oh, it's Wednesday, hump day. Happy hump day.
Thanks, Nancy.
I'll see you next time.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.